Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In the next couple of podcasts, we're going to deal with the biblical character Ruth. The book of Ruth is a beloved story, primarily because it features a non-Israelite woman utterly devoted to her Israelite mother-in-law, not to mention her Israelite God. In many ways, it is an idyllic story. However, delving more deeply into the narrative, we will discover aspects of this little book, containing only 4 chapters, that are often neglected. Before we treat the story, we need to say something about its location. In the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is part of a collection referred to as the Writings, HaKetuvim. This collection contains, for example, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Koheleth or Ecclesiastes, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, Lamentations, and the like. In the Greek version of the Jewish Bible, however, Ruth follows the book of Judges and precedes Samuel. This location is likely due to the manner in which the book begins, namely, in the days when the judges ruled. Given that beginning, it was logical to situate the story right after the book of Judges. Its location does not alter its meaning greatly, but it is something to keep in mind. In any case, as the narrative starts when the judges ruled, we are told at the outset that the land, which of course means the land of Israel, was gripped by a famine. That's in verse 1 of chapter 1. Because of this famine, a certain man living in Bethlehem decided to go and live, perhaps temporarily, in Moab, presumably since Moab was not affected by the famine ravishing Israel. Though the story has just begun, there are a couple of ironic points to consider. One is that the name of the town that this man was leaving, namely Bethlehem, in Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread or house of food. That town possibly got that name because it was a granary. Regardless of the etiology of the name, though, the man about to leave could no longer feed himself or his family in a town called House of Bread. A second irony involves his destination. The man was headed for Moab. Any mention of this country would immediately trigger a negative Israelite memory. A famous story recounted in Genesis describes how Moab and his brother Ammon had been conceived. Lot, Abraham's nephew, had taken up residence in an area in which Sodom and Gomorrah were located. Because of the wickedness of these cities and 3 other ones, they soon found themselves under divine judgment. Lot and his family were forced to flee the destruction. As it turns out, only Lot and his 2 daughters survived. Lot's wife and the daughter's mother did not make it. Inexplicably, these 2 daughters believed that everyone else in the world had perished. They and their father were the only ones to survive what they thought was a total destruction of the world. In light of this belief, the daughters took desperate measures to ensure a future. They got their father, Lot, drunk, and successively had sex with him. This led to 2 births, Moab and Ammon. This is why in Israel the mention of these 2 names brought to mind a disgusting, incestuous relationship between Lot and his 2 daughters. One could forgive an Israelite man for going elsewhere to find food, but going to Moab is beyond the pale. Regardless, Moab was the man's destination. His name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The couple had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Again, this story does not want us to forget that they came from Bethlehem in Judah. And as well, the story wants us to know that when they arrived in Moab, they stayed in Moab. That's in verse 2. Unfortunately, almost as soon as this little family got to Moab, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi as a widow with 2 sons. A widow in Israel having to take care of 2 sons would experience tough sledding. One can only imagine how difficult Naomi's situation was in a foreign country. Nevertheless, the family went into survival mode. The 2 sons soon grew up and acquired Moabite wives. One wife was named Orpah, and the other wife was named Ruth. For 10 years they managed to navigate in Moab. Then disaster struck once more. Both sons died. Poor Naomi. She had followed her husband to Moab, only to lose him and both of her sons. Now there were 3 women who had been widowed. Their prospects were surely dim. This is narrated in verses 4 through 5 of chapter 1. Nevertheless, once Naomi heard that the Israelite God had taken care of Israel's famine by seeing to it that the nation now had food, she, along with her daughters-in-law, decided to return to Judah. That's in verses 6 and 7. But Naomi did not think it was best for Orpah and Ruth to try to make a new start in Israel. So she encouraged them to go back to live in their mother's homes. Along with this encouragement, Naomi blessed the 2 women by hoping that the Israelite God would be as gracious to them as they had been with her. Naomi noted that her daughters-in-law had coped well with the deaths of their husbands and treated her very kindly as well. That's in verse 8. She further hoped that they would also find new husbands. At the point of this emotional time of separation, the women all had a good cry. That's in verse 9. Suddenly, though, Orpah and Ruth said that they would go back with Naomi, back, quote unquote, to your people, meaning Israel. That's in verse 10. Naomi did not, however, think that was a good idea. She claimed that she could not help her daughters-in-law at this stage of their lives. For example, she was long past the time of bearing children. It would be absurd for the women to hold out hope that Naomi could provide them with husbands. Even if she could still get pregnant, what sense would it make for them to sit around to wait for the boys, this assumes that Naomi could give birth to male children, to grow up to become their husbands? If they insisted on their returning with her, they would forfeit the possibility of ever being married again. That's in verses 12 to 13. Though Naomi was being gracious, she was still bitter, blaming her God for how badly her life had turned out. After this poignant statement, the women commenced crying again. Orpah took Naomi's advice, kissed her mother-in-law, and then headed back to Moab. But Ruth did not take Naomi's advice. Instead, she clung to Naomi. Once Naomi realized that Ruth wanted to continue the journey back to Israel, she doubled down by insisting that her daughter-in-law do what Orpah had done. That's in verse 15. At this juncture, Ruth made crystal clear her intentions, her unwavering intentions. She argued that Naomi should stop trying to prevent her from continuing the journey. Indeed, Ruth asserted that wherever Naomi went, she would go. Wherever Naomi lodged, that was where she would lodge. Your people, meaning of course Israel, would become my people. Your God would become my God. Finally, wherever Naomi would die was the same place where she, Ruth, would die. That's in verses 16 to 17. Ruth even made her commitments a pledge to the Israelite God. She invoked the tetragrammaton, YHWH, the distinct personal name of the Israelite deity, by vowing that the God would be free to harm her if even death separated her from her mother-in-law. After this stunning statement, Naomi relented and stopped her efforts to dissuade her daughter-in-law. This was some commitment on Ruth's part. Her reasons can only be inferred. Still, she leaves nothing out of her allegiance to Naomi or to Naomi's people, land, or God. If nothing else, this breaks the stereotype that daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law often have tense relationships. Ruth wants to be joined at the hip to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Whether this will work out remains to be seen. In any case, after this exchange, Naomi and Ruth continued their journey back to Bethlehem. When they arrived, the whole town was somehow immediately aware. The women were flabbergasted. They could not believe their eyes when they said, "Is this Naomi?" That's in verse 19. But Naomi was not in the mood for such a gracious welcome. She did not even want to be called Naomi, a name that means pleasant one. Instead, she invited the townspeople to refer to her as Mara, a word that means bitter. She wanted this name change to be acknowledged because, according to Naomi, the Israelite God had been responsible for the unfortunate events that she experienced in Moab. She pointed out that when she left Israel, she had everything, a husband and 2 sons. But on her return, she had lost not only a husband, but both of her sons. For her money, the Almighty, referring to the Israelite God, had brought on her this calamity. That's verses 20 and 21. Ironically, when Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, the town was living up to its name. That is because the beginning of the barley harvest was underway. Grain was growing. People could be fed. This is good news. At the same time, both Naomi and Ruth were widows. More common than not, widows had to scrape by when they did not have menfolk to help. Neither woman had a husband or grown sons. They would have to do the best they could. As it turns out, Naomi had a relative through her husband who was a man of means. That's in chapter 2, verse 1. This man's name was Boaz. Somehow it had not occurred to Naomi to ask this man for a little financial help. Ruth, on the other hand, had other plans. Since it was harvest time, she suggested to Naomi that she, Ruth, should go to the fields to glean grain, thinking also that she might make a favorable impression on whoever happened to own the field. Naomi thought this was a great idea, so she encouraged Ruth to go to the fields. That's in verses 2 to 3 of chapter 2. Of course, gleaning was one of the activities that Israel allowed and even encouraged to help poor people to get enough to eat. Basically, gleaning had to do with gathering the grain that the harvesters missed. Sometimes the harvesters tried not to be overly efficient so that they could leave enough grain to be gathered by the needy. When Ruth went out into the fields, she just happened to go to a field that Boaz, Naomi's husband's kinsman, his a rich kinsman owned. That's in verse 3 of chapter 2. Boaz had come to the field himself that day, greeting and exchanging blessings with the reapers. That's in verse 4. At that point, he asked his servant, who was in charge of the harvesters, about a woman who had shown up in his field. The woman was obviously Ruth. The man noted that she was, quote, the Moabite maiden, who had returned with Naomi, obviously from Moab. That's in verse 6. It is difficult not to notice the emphasis on Moab when the man spoke. He called Ruth the Moabite maiden, and then, somewhat redundantly, mentioned that she had come back from Moab with Naomi. By no means does the narrator want us to forget this connection to Moab. The servant in charge went on to say that the woman had asked permission to glean. In fact, the woman had been gleaning all day, from early in the morning to the time when he and Boaz were discussing her. That's in verse 7 of chapter 2. We will have to wait until the next podcast to find out whether Ruth had hit the jackpot on happening on Boaz's field, or whether she had made a crucial and strategic mistake. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me record your email there so I can contact you when we're getting ready for our mini courses. If you want me to answer a question on any issue having to do with the Old Testament, or for that matter, the New Testament, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.